Welcome to the very first Nevin Economic Research Institute video in what we hope will be a series addressing some of the main topics and issues of relevance to workers in Irish society and in the Irish economy. My name is David Gibney and I'll be hosting this edition of the new series. The Nevin Economic Research Institute was founded by the trade union movement a number of years ago in the middle of the economic crisis. And one of the reasons it was established was to challenge some of the narratives that are out there about the Irish economy and the Irish workforce. In this week's edition, we're going to be talking about the new Employment Miscellaneous Provisions Act, which was only brought in on the 4th of March of this year and has already been utilised by thousands of workers across the Irish economy. It is the most significant piece of legislation in decades in this country in terms of workers' rights. The legislation itself didn't come about because of a benevolent government. It came about because trade union activists and members all across the state lobbied their TDs and got organised and pushed for the new legislation. In particular, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and Patricia King led the way along with mandate members and mandate activists who went on strike to raise awareness of the issues that were affecting workers in precarious employment. I'm going to ask the first question to Muireann Dalton, who came from Dunnes Stores, was engaged in the issue around insecure work, took industrial action on the 2nd of April 2015, which was really the beginning of the debate around the secure hours or banded hour contract legislation. So, Muireann, can you tell us a little bit about what happened during your campaign for secure hours?
Yeah, sure, Dave. Well, we were in work and we were going around, working as everybody does in their job, presuming that the harder you worked, the more hours you got, because that was the impression that we were given by management. So you were employed on a 15 to 40 hour contract, or somewhere 15 to 37 hour contract. But you quickly realised that if the manager didn't like you, you got 15 hours a week. If you went sick, you got 15 hours a week. If you stood up for yourself, you got 15 hours a week. It didn't matter whether they needed you or they didn't need you. And one of the things that really used to frustrate staff, especially people like myself who, my husband was out of work and I wanted 40 hours a week, and I kept saying that I wanted 40 hours a week. It was quite clear in the store that they needed people for 40 hours a week. But when we became vocal about what was wrong, and it was quite clear what they were doing, they were hiring 2 people for each job so that they could pit people against each other, so that they would always have the control, so that we wouldn't come together and say this is wrong. So they'd rather hire 2 people for 22, 25 hours a week. And it was so frustrating for us. And then especially at Christmas, because in Dunnes there was a pay scale for 5 years. So what would happen at Christmas time when they really needed more people, or people to do more hours, they would hire in seasonal staff, cut our hours because we would have been on more money. So the seasonal staff were getting brought in at 9.27, or whatever the starting rate was at that time. Through mandate over the 4-year campaign, we got a 15% pay rise. But at that time, it was 9.17. So if I was on 9.60, they'd cut my hours just to save that few cent, bring someone in for the 6 weeks, give them all the hours. And this was ongoing. And especially in the larger stores, you would see it all the time, and it would be ongoing all throughout the year. That's why we went to our trade union and said, look, this has to stop. There has to be something we do about this. And the rest is kind of history. We all came together, the campaign started off slowly, we built and built as we went along, and the more we spoke and came together from different stores. That's the beauty of being in the trade union, that when the committee of shop stewards came together, you realise, it's not just my store in Newtown, it's happening in Gorey, it's happening in the Corners Court, it's happening in Blanche. So you got to realise, you're not alone. Okay, we're all in this together. Mandate are helping us and guiding us what we need to do, and the campaign just rolled and started. And I think we knew we were onto a winner because what we were looking for wasn't necessarily a pay rise. So everybody assumes, and I've spoken to a lot of people about different strikes, and it seems to be kind of people have this presumption that if you go on strike, it's for a pay rise. But we weren't, and the public were behind us because they were our customers. And the flexi-hour contracts really affects your mental health. It really does affect people. So that's what that legislation is doing now. When that comes in, it's saving people on the shop floor.
Well, we already know in Mandate that we've had more than 2,000 applications in Dunnes Stores for these secure hour contracts in the last 2 months since the legislation was enacted on the 4th of March. So when we were campaigning for the legislation, we were constantly being told by the employer community that there was no need for this, that it wasn't a big issue on the ground, when in reality, with all the surveys that we'd been doing of members, including Dunnes members, I remember the survey in 2014 returned results that 85% of Dunnes Stores workers said that allocation of hours is used as a method of control or intimidation over them. It's not as high in the bar trade or in the retail sector generally, but that's what was happening in the second biggest private sector employer in the country. Michael, just in terms of that, the prevalence of precarious work, and I know you and the Nevin Economic Research Institute are working on a paper around this issue. Can you tell us a little bit about the prevalence and how many people are affected by these types of contracts?
Well, I mean, there's the challenge is to actually estimate those who are not only affected by the contract, but then estimate those who are at risk of precariousness, because you've probably heard over the last year or two, there have been a couple of reports that come out, a lot of newspaper commentary, which is more or less trying to suggest that there's not much to see here, move on. That, yes, there's a small amount of precarious, a small proportion of the workforce is precarious. Usually it's among younger people. They grow out of it. I don't know exactly how that works, but a young person, you expect to be in a precarious situation, but you will transition to a permanent job. So Kieran Nugent from NERI and Sinead Pembroke, who has written a number of papers on precariousness for Task, and myself, we got together to see if we could try to nail this down. Now, one of the problems is there's no definition of precariousness. There's no agreed definition, official definition, either in Ireland or at the EU level. And so when you start to explore exactly what precariousness is, you find that it's a range of things, not just the employment contract. I mean, we kind of think of temporary contracts as precarious. We think of, if you're a part-timer, want to work full-time, but can't find full-time work, that's usually called enforced underemployment. That's precariousness. Certain types of self-employment might be considered precariousness. But actually, the EU Parliament came out with a very substantial report and says it goes much further, because it's about low pay. It's actually about collective rights, because they pointed out that in workplaces where, the type of thing that you're talking about, where trade union, people's right to bargain collectively is not secure, those can tend to be more precarious places. They look impact on health and safety. So there's a whole range of things. So what we've pulled out from this is, one, precariousness is growing. Though it's hard to see the trajectory, because prior to the crash, it was there, but it was at a relatively lower level, and of course it increased substantially during the crash. And since the recovery has come in, it's fallen. But what we've found is that we could actually be entering into a new norm, whereby the levels of precariousness, though they have fallen from the height of the recession, are still much higher than they were prior to the crash. Finally, and this is kind of a long preface to talking about the numbers, sometimes people aren't aware that they're in a precarious situation. Imagine that, you've been kind of getting jobs a few weeks here, a few weeks there, and all of a sudden an employer comes to you with a 3-year temporary contract. Well, 3 years seems like an eternity. Yeah. So when you're asked, are you on a permanent contract, if they are full-time, people will say yes. So, in fact, in one example, Kieran Nugent was examining the prevalence of temporary contracts among young people. And there was a fair bit of difference just between the main methodologies. But then the National Youth Council of Ireland had commissioned the Red C poll to also look at the number of young people in temporary contracts. They asked the same question as the CSO and all the rest, but then they added 5 words. And that contract, something like, and that contract will come to an end. And when that was put to people, they said, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, will come to an end. All of a sudden, the figure doubled. So we have the situation. Depending on how you look at the precariousness, whether it's defined as an employment contract, or whether you look at their living conditions, which then means you have to look at things like deprivation, not able to meet an unexpected expense. That the number can range anywhere from 25-30% up to 45-50% of all employees. Now, just stress, that's the percentage of people who are at risk. That doesn't mean all of them are in precariousness, but it's at risk. It's just like the way we measure poverty. You sometimes hear that it's at poverty levels. Well, it's actually at risk of poverty. Nonetheless, if you're at risk, if you're in a contract where you're at risk of precariousness, or if you're in a living condition whereby you're in work, but nonetheless, if you have an unexpected expense, boiler blows up, a washing machine breaks down, there's a hole in your roof, and you can't meet that expense, then we understand what the term precariousness is. I mean, in this discussion, I'll go into a few more details, but I think that's probably enough for people to absorb this in one go, you know.
In terms of a practical sort of example of this at risk of precarious work, we had a strike last year in Lloyd's Pharmacy, 10 days of industrial action, where we were highlighting the fact that the workers, a large proportion of them were on 0-hour contracts. And when we issued the statements to the media, the company itself came out with statements saying they never have had 0-hour contracts. They don't exist within the company, and the company has no plans to bring them in. What was interesting was we released 6 of those contracts to the media, and the contracts say, and these are the words within the contract, your normal hours of work are flexible as agreed with your manager, spread over up to 5 days between Monday and Sunday, and may include late night and weekend work. Now, to the workers themselves, when we were asking them, are you a precarious contract worker? They were saying, no, I get 40 hours per week. But the fact of the matter is, on a whim of a local manager, they can slash those hours down to 5 or 10 or 15 because there's no minimum defined hours within the contract. So that was one of the key issues in dispute. We wanted those secure hour contracts. And again, the employer bodies came out and said, no, they don't exist, these 0-hour contracts. The employer itself said they don't exist. And therefore, that aligned with, I suppose, the Done Stores campaign, where you guys were, after taking industrial action, on, as I said, the 2nd of April. And tell us what happened the very next day after that in terms of the company proving our point about these flexible contracts.
And they really did prove our point. Just quickly, on the run up to the strike, they introduced communication meetings, which we never had before, and they were on a monthly basis. And they kept saying to us, what can we do not to make you go on strike? And give us proper contracts, give us full-time contracts, send someone down to talk to us. So nobody would come down and talk to us. Even the day before, the boss was going around saying, do you get 36 hours? We're like, you're not listening. It's the contract. I'm going for a mortgage. I can't get a mortgage. It says 15 hours. So we went out on strike, came in the next day. The lead people in the stores were pinpointed. There was people let go, which we never ever thought they would do, because as we all know, it's your constitutional right to go out and strike. But there's a loophole in the law that if you're not in a company for more than 12 months, and there was one girl who was 2 weeks away from 12 months, was a member of the trade union, and was told her services weren't required anymore.
Well, we saw that we were getting the reports the very next day after the strike in head office. Come, as you say, at 1 o'clock, all of these stories of people being moved around. There was 4 ways that they were victimising the workers for going on strike to try and get these secure hour contracts. One was slashing their hours. Another was moving them around from place to place within the business. Another one was if women in particular being targeted for, if they had childcare facilities, that they'd be moved from the morning shift to the evening shift so that they'd have to get all of their childcare changed. It was a horrible period of time,
Dave,
which
really
I remember the line you gave us at the time, we can't go out on strike with these types of contracts. It's impossible to challenge that type of contract when they can just use that contract against you when you try and raise awareness of it. So if Dunn Stores won't change itself, then we'll have to change the world around Dunn Stores. And that was June the 6th, you said that at a national demonstration. But what that leads us to, I suppose, is the question around the implications of these types of contracts. So in our opinion, I mean, Mandate for pre my time in Mandate in 2006 did a national negotiations with Tesco, because we recognised that the flexibility in hours was very damaging to the workers themselves. And the first ever banded hour contract agreement was negotiated and signed in 2006. We then went on and negotiated one in pennies in 2013. And then we got to the process of trying it in unorganised or non-union companies, and it was impossible. You just could not win because they were so vehemently anti-union. And of course, when you're trying to win a pay increase and you want workers to go on strike for that, they're not going to go on strike if they can have their hours slashed.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole idea, isn't it? You want to prevent somebody from going out on strike to get higher pay, and the reason is you want to keep them on lower pay. And there is a relationship between the more precarious forms of employment. One thinks, for instance, of marginal part-time employment, which means working less than 20 hours a week. There is a relationship between those more extreme types of precarious contracts and low pay. I mean, I'll just give you an example. In terms of deprivation, the CSO measures deprivation. They have 12 deprivation, what they describe as examples of deprivation: inability to heat a home, inability to afford a substantial meal once every 2 days, inability to purchase a rainproof raincoat, a coat, or shoes, or you can't afford to go out once a month with friends. So the deprivation things covers a range of, say, food poverty, kind of material poverty, and then social, poverty of social activities. And if you hit two of those, the CSO describes you as living in deprivation. Well, first off, it should be said that 12% of everybody at work is officially described as deprived. So this idea that somehow you can see deprivation, no, you don't. You don't actually know people when they go behind their door what their living conditions are, because people don't like to talk about it. So that's the first thing. 1 in 8 of the total workforce. And if you think by any way, and I know that the people who are in precarious situation desperately want what's called a permanent full-time job. Yeah. But let's not be under any illusions here. A permanent full-time job is not necessarily a path out of deprivation, because while it's 12% for all, 10% of people in permanent full-time work suffer multiple deprivation experiences. And then when you get to somebody who's part-time, wants to work full-time but can't find the extra hours or find the job to get it full-time, then you're talking about very high levels of deprivation, 27, 28%. When you find, and this mostly affects women, when you find people are working part-time because it's due to they're looking after children or their family circumstances, their deprivation levels are over 17, 18%. In other words, 1 in 5. And because we don't have the social supports like care in the community, child care or elder care in the community, they're forced into that situation. Can I just say this? I mean, I can kind of rumble on with these numbers and all that, and that's what kind of, the nerds in NERI do and what I do and all that, I think we should never, ever lose our anger or our passion at the type of things that Muireann was expressing. It is, and let's be clear, it is a social obscenity. And I'm sure I could find another word for it, but I don't think they allow those words on the internet.
No rules at the moment.
Okay, well, anyway. It is a social obscenity that people going to work, generating, by the way, value-added, generating profits for their employer. I mean, the employer is not a charity. I mean, workers are actually making this contribution to every one of their employers, and all they want in return is to be treated with some minimum level of respect and dignity. It is an obscenity that the men and women in Lloyd's Pharmacy had to walk up and down pavements for 10 days to get what every European worker has as of right. I mean, it's going back to labor relations in a bygone era. We pretend to be a modern country. We want modern infrastructure, we have modern employment practices, modern industries, and yet we've got these pre-modern type of labor laws. So I don't think we should, so sometimes when I get buried down in the numbers, I think it's important to remember these stories. They're vitally important, and they keep us connected to the reason why we are trade unionists, why we're on the left, and why we continue to campaign.
Yeah, and to echo that a little bit, because this is, we can only sort of touch on some of the stories that have been told to both Muireann and myself, and probably yourself as well, Michael, over the last couple of years. But it's even more insidious when workers have 15-hour contracts and a company can slash your wages from €400 per week to €150 per week, which is obviously below the dole. They also have the capacity to get rid of your family income supplement and your supplementary social welfare, which was one of the things that happened after the Dunnes Stores strike, because you're not entitled to family income supplement unless you work 19 hours plus per week, or guaranteed for 3 months. And your supplementary social welfare, your dole, your part-time dole, is done on a daily basis. So they can spread those 15 or 16 or 17 or 18 hours over the space of 3 or 4 days to make sure that you can't access the supplementary social welfare. So not only do these employers have control over the wages they have to pay you, they have control over your access to the social welfare system as well, which is an enormous amount of power that an employer has over a worker. And some of the stories, if you remember, Muireann, in the run-up to the strike, a large proportion of shop stewards actually came to us and said at one of the shop stewards meetings, I can't get a mortgage because I go into the bank and I say, look, I've been earning €400 a week for the past 15, 16 years. Let's say your contract says 15 hours, not 40 hours. I can only give you, according to the central bank rules, 3.5 times your income, your guaranteed income. So therefore, you're entitled to a mortgage of €32,000 for the year. And there's very few places you're going to buy in Ireland for €32,000 at the moment. So what they were able to do, the employers as well, was impact on your actual living conditions and where you could live and where you couldn't live. So Dunnes Stores workers, with thousands of other workers across the economy, have been stuck in the private rental sector because they cannot actually get a mortgage whatsoever.
That's the impact they're having on people's lives. That's the control, but they know that this isn't happening by chance. They know that. They know exactly what they're doing. They know that when, you can't go and get your credit union loan, you can't get, as you say, your mortgage, that you're stuck in a circle and you're begging for hours. It should never have been allowed, and I'm so happy that the legislation has come in, because it will make a huge difference. And I've been talking to people since the legislation came in, and they're delighted. They're absolutely, they're thrilled, because it's like a weight lifted off their shoulders, because you just can't explain what it's like walking on eggshells in work.
I mean, again, going back to something that Michael just mentioned, which is, about that, something along the lines of the power. People are always saying, how do we deal with the gig economy and these low-hour contracts? And it's all sort of new. It's not actually. It's really old-school style of employment measures. It's like going back 100 years to the docks, and a worker who has gone on strike effectively became blacklisted, and an employer wouldn't take them on. Well, this is a legalised form of that, where you go on strike, so I'm able to slash your hours to 10. I remember one worker came to us in 2013, actually, which was the first time I really heard this level of an impact, who complained in a retail outlet not too far from here, complained about a fire exit being blocked, and he had been working 48 hours for 7 years. And they said, you won't complain about that again. 6 months, I'm giving you a cut to your contracted hours of 10. You'll have to go, and he had to go and go get a loan from the credit union to keep him going for 6 months. But they were the real stories that were happening. So every time I was hearing in the media that this wasn't an issue, I remember the ESRI released a report saying that the gig economy wasn't as bad as people were making it out to be, which was during the campaign for this legislation. it's infuriating as a trade unionist who's been talking to these workers and hearing their stories, and then to be reading in the national newspapers, this isn't an issue. This needs to go away.
And if anybody saw on the ground what was going on, like you just wouldn't. You wouldn't let your son, daughter, mother, father, auntie, uncle be treated like that. Do you know, like you can forget about childcare when you're working in the retail industry, because you don't know when you're working, you don't know what hours you're working, and you don't know how much pay you're going to get. So I can't ask you to mind my children and say I'll give you £100 a week because I don't know whether I'm going to have it. Do you know? And that was another impact that those contracts had. It was just stress, constant stress for people.
Yeah.
But I think we should be conscious of the fact that the type of non-standard contracts, we talked about non-standard would be those that are not full-time permanent or just even permanent contracts, because you can be part-time permanent as well. Some people do want to be part-time, and so permanent contracts. But let's be clear, they are on the rise. And I think especially coming out of this recession, as I said, we're going to be looking into a new norm whereby, okay, it is improved since the worst part of the recession, but now there's much higher levels of precariousness than existed prior to the crash. For instance, if you look at new contracts, those that are just people have only been employed, say, for 1 year or less than 1 year, new contracts. Prior to the crash, 45% of new contracts were non-standard or atypical, or in other words, at risk of precariousness. That would be, those are where you would usually find the risks of precariousness. It was 45%. Today it's 55%. It is on the increase. For instance, for young people, prior to the crash, according to CSO, now again, the databases have different numbers, but let's just stick with our own CSO, 25% of young people had these atypical contracts, non-standard contracts. 25%. Today, 44%. Not quite doubled.
We've talked a little bit about the implications. I mean, I know Sinead Pembroke as well has constructed a report on the mental health impacts and the other impacts from Task, I think the report was, and she made a number of very good recommendations that we don't seem to get too much of after these reports have been done from a political perspective. We've got one piece of legislation now that does address some of this, and I'll talk a little bit about what the legislation does and how it impacts on workers in reality. But Michael, in terms of other solutions that are needed to address the economy, in terms of both precarious work and low pay, is there any other recommendations or talking points that you would have for politicians if they genuinely did want to challenge this narrative or this employment type?
Yeah, there are a few, and they do range across from the both the industrial, the social supports, and to create a more accommodative social protection system. Just go through it. First off, we do need collective bargaining. We desperately need sectoral collective bargaining. We need collective bargaining across the sector. It's across the sectors that you can first off address the particular types of precariousness, the precariousness that may be particular to that industry. Banded hours, of course, is extremely important in retail. It might not be that important in other sectors, but in other sectors, bogus self-employment or high levels of temporary contracts might be more important, or if and when contracts. By the way, as an example, if and when contracts, we don't know how many there are of those. We don't know to what extent they're growing. So we need to get to a situation of sectoral collective bargaining. We won't get there until we essentially become stronger, and that means increasing our density. We have very low levels of density in the private sector, and even lower levels of density in those sectors that are disproportionately impacted by precariousness. Very different. One thinks of the hospitality sector, extremely low. So collective bargaining is one. Also, we can do one of two things. We can actually kind of again go for particular measures. For instance, temporary employment. Some countries, temporary employment, by the way, just to let everybody know, that's when your contract has a defined end. It might be a year long, or it might be at the end of a particular project, or it might be you're replacing somebody who may be on sick leave or maternity leave, and when they return, your contract ends. So a temporary contract has a defined ending point. And obviously, it suits a lot of employers in terms of flexibility, as they call it, to have high levels of temporary contracts. I think about 10% of the workforce is on these temporary contracts. Now, what some countries have done is, okay, they say you can have your temporary contract, but the worker gets a kind of a small redundancy payment at the end of that. In other words, it's to disincentivize the take-up of these. So if you worked for a year, on a temporary contract, you might get 2 weeks, 1 week, 2 weeks. If you've worked on a 2 or 3 year, it might be longer. So you could look at something like that. Or you could actually look at giving part-time workers the right to extra hours when they become available in the workplace. This is something I believe an EU directive was supposed to introduce. Going back, I think it's 1999, 1998. Anyway, the point is to actually make that part of law so that, when the extra hours become available or when a full-time position comes up and it's a like-for-like situation, the part-time employee should have the first call on those hours. So you can do that. But I mean, let's look at a more general thing. For instance, again, just returning back to this situation, and because this affects mostly women. But women who are working part-time, but they're doing so due to family circumstances, looking after elderly, looking after children, maybe looking after a disabled relative. Nearly half of them would not be able to cope with an unexpected expense. And if you think about that, and I think that anybody who's in that situation, it's a terrible situation to be in. But even more so for the woman who, first off, as I say, is going out working, making this economic contribution, making the contribution to her employer, to the company, to generate profits, which they distribute in dividends and all that. So there's a lot of people who are really benefiting from her work thing, but the state is also benefiting from the fact that she might be caring for an elderly person instead of it being, quote unquote, a charge on the state. In other words, she's actually taking on the role that in many countries the public sector would be doing, or plugging in gaps because we failed to invest in childcare. So you have this person doing two types of work, one work for the employer, but also working for the state, working for society, and they're the ones, half of them could, they're living on that fine line. Yeah. So therefore, an investment in the social supports would help people in that situation, and it makes up a substantial amount in terms of a significant amount in terms of precariousness. So, for instance, affordable childcare, home community care for elderly, so they can take the burden off the woman or the man, but as I say, it's mostly women who can then enter and get full time to try to get full time or more hours to get full time employment. But I think that we will also have to look at a social protection system. The interface between somebody working kind of uneven hours or having uncertain hours or on if and when contracts, the interface between them and the social protection system can be extremely complex, extremely time consuming, and it can take weeks to sort that out, and in between that you've already gotten another job and stuff like that. So we need a social protection system that actually gives support to workers in those situations, and I would even go further, that actually gives them a bit of bargaining leverage, if you will, a little bit of power, alongside collective bargaining, which will really help. Well, at first stage, join a trade union, and then try to get the collective bargaining. That would really help, but also you can do that through the social protection system. The last thing employers want is employees being able to quit their place and go somewhere else. Yeah. They want their employees stuck. That's why employers love unemployment, because unemployment, there's no jobs out there. So, people have to stay in their workplace and then have to put up with all sorts of crap because of that. But when not only do you have, when you're in a situation where there's more employment in the economy, that means that people can leave and have a better chance of finding a job somewhere else. And then you have a supportive social protection system whereby when they leave, they at least, or even when they go out on strike, even when they go on strike, they would still have this guaranteed money.
Yeah. This is exactly what they won't do.
We can dare to dream.
We can definitely dare to dream. I can't see it happening in the very near future about getting some of these things done. I mean, Mandate has been arguing for refundable tax credits for since at least 10 years now. And getting any traction on any of these pieces of legislation that we've been seeking has been very, very difficult. Getting the banded hours legislation in took 4 years, obviously well worth it. But, you know, going back to even that point that you raised, Michael, and I know Muireann will remember this because we were both in the Oireachtas committee the day that they debated it, the ability to seek more hours, the resistance that we had to having that put in. So there was an amendment put into the legislation.
Can I just ask, how can anybody what was the basis of their opposition?
Oh, you love this. It's hilarious.
So usually is.
You couldn't make it up. And honestly, I remember watching it live then from the Dáil committee a couple of weeks later when they brought it back and going, are they actually serious? They're actually for real. The amendment was put in by John Collins and Claire Daly, and it said very simply, in the event of hours becoming available, an employer shall be required to offer any surplus hours to existing part-time employees first. Very simple. The wording is actually taken from the EU Part-Time Worker Directive. Okay, so the word is basically cleared from the EU, and it works, and it works everywhere else in Europe. And I met with the ETUC lawyers there recently, and they all said, yeah, that works everywhere else. The Irish government came out with statements saying, well, what happens in Ryanair, for instance, when the pilot leaves? Are we going to have to give the cabin crew the hours to work the flying of the plane? They actually used this, and it's on the Dáil record for anyone who doesn't believe me. But these were either clutching at straws, clutching for arguments, trying to find any reason in the world to not allow existing part-time employees to seek more hours at work. Because deep down, the employers in particular know that gives workers an enormous amount of power that they don't have right now. Just to give the listeners a bit of an idea, the legislation contains 4 new rights for workers, really. One is workers are entitled to now have their core statement in terms of conditions of employment given to them within 5 days of employment. 0-hour contracts are banned in almost all circumstances, which leaves a little bit of a loophole open there now. By the way, the new minimum amount of hours that an employer is required to give you is 1, so it's not exactly perfect in terms of eliminating 0-hour contracts. I don't know whether a worker feels much better off receiving a contract of 1-hour contract. Workers are now entitled to minimum payment if their employer fails to provide them with work. Again, there's weaknesses in this. So your employer calls you in, you arrive, they say, sorry, you're not needed anymore, go home. Up till now, you weren't entitled to any payment whatsoever. The new legislation provides for 3 hours paid, but at the minimum wage. So you might be on 20 or 30 hours or 30 euros per hour, but now your minimum payment is based on the minimum wage or registered employment agreement. And the 4th key right is that workers are guaranteed the hours of work that reflect their normal working week, which is the bit we've been talking about. So and that's the bit we really lobbied hard for as a result of the Duns and Lloyds and other workers, and that is after 12 months of employment, or every 12 months, you get a contract of employment that reflects the hours you've been working over those previous 12 months. So if you've been working 26 hours, you move into the 26 to 31 hour band. Your previous contract might have said 10, but because you've been working those hours, it regularizes it for the next 12 months. And again, another thing that the employers are doing on the back of that is you get your 26 to 31 hour contract. They're saying you can't work above it, and we're going to keep you on the bottom. And Duns have been doing this, threatening workers that if you get this, you've been getting 36, we're going to put you to the bottom of the 31 band, and you won't be getting any more than that because we don't want to have to implement this in the following year. And so it shows you how resourceful employers can be. And of course, the best way to challenge this is, as we would all argue, is join a union, get your whole place unionised, and ensure that the employers cannot do that sort of have that sort of behaviour.
Well, you've convinced me, Dave. I mean, the employers are a sneaky brood, and to join a trade union, is one of the best defences, because even with the statutory rights, without a union there to back you up, it's going to be hard for individuals on their own, isolated, to take on, to try to assert their rights in a certain situation, or to know when the employer is acting outside of the legislation. This is going to mount, because we're not only seeing an increase in the kind of non-standard contracts. That's going to increase because the complexity of employment relations is going to increase. I mean, there are things like employee sharing, voucher-based work, portfolio work, platform employment, which is the gig economy, collaborative employment, never mind the kind of casual or if and when contracts. All these things, some of them haven't even come to Ireland, but they are emerging in particular sectors in Europe and the US. I mean, the thing is, capitalism is constantly changing. It's a very dynamic process. So the best protection for people is to join a trade union, but it's also a reminder. I mean, first off, the persistence of the trade union movement, and in this case, mandate, in pursuing the banded hours for 4 years. We have to double that persistence, if you will, and we do have to up our game. We have to improve, and there's always room for improvement. That's not a criticism, because if we don't do that, we will be staring into a future where there's fewer and fewer people who have rights under a permanent full-time contract. I don't know what kind of society that's going to look like, where you have people in more uncertainty, more insecure, more uncertainty of hours and work, more insecurity in terms of things like rent or being able to afford things. That's what we're facing.
Yeah. And I do think, and it's good that you raised it, Michael, I do think that we need to acknowledge that this legislation didn't come about by accident. It wasn't just that the government all of a sudden had a benevolent feeling that they said we must express to workers automatically. It came about through thousands of workers taking industrial action and being victimised. It came about because the Irish Congress of Trade Unions lobbied very heavily and strongly for the legislation, along with a whole group of unions who were out there pushing for it as well. Mandate members and activists, I have to give a big shout out to them, because the amount of lobbying that they did, we specifically targeted Fianna Fáil all across the country, so there wasn't one Fianna Fáil TD that didn't have mandate members dropping down and saying, hello, will you sign our Secure Hours Better Future Charter? And in particular, one member I want to mention, David Campbell, who was a Dunnes Stores worker who visited everyone. We might get a bit emotional on this bit, but he passed away 2 weeks ago. And didn't see the benefits of the legislation himself. But overall, the benefits that the whole entire Irish workforce are going to get, again, came from trade unions being active, heavily active. I think that's something that we have to remember. We'll wrap that up now, I think. I think we've probably exhausted all our time on this piece of legislation, but it's an important one and it's an important debate. So we'll say goodbye to you, the viewer, and what we will finish up by saying is that this video series hasn't actually got a name yet. But if any of our listeners or viewers at home have any suggestions, or if you have any comments about this edition or what we should be covering in the future, please do get in contact. And any of the reports that we've been talking about and the information, that'll all be displayed in the comment section, both on YouTube and Vimeo and any other provisions that we put this video out on. So thank you for listening to us, and thank you to our guests, Muireann Dalton, activist with Dunnes Stores and Mandate Trade Union, Michael Taft, SIPTU Research Officer, and thank you to NERI for asking me to host this first edition.